Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 4 of Little Blue Book number 1030, titled The World's Great Religions, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926-27, somewhere around there, 28. Mid-1920s is when he wrote most of these. And in this final part 4, we're going to do chapters 7 and 8. My nose had an itch. And here we go. Chapter 7, The Religions of Greece and Rome. All the peoples of Europe, except the Finns, Hungarians, and Turks, who are Asiatic invaders, belong to a single primitive family. And the Hindu Persians are, we saw, another branch of the same family. When the Ice Age ended, Europe was covered gradually with dense forests full of game, and our European ancestors pushed north, hunting the bear and the boar, while the Hindus and Persians turned south. The Greek or Hellenist branch of the family soon turned south and poured over the country which we now call Greece. The Roman branch broke off next and made for Italy. The Slavs remained midway, and the Teutons continued as far as the Baltic, then westward and southward. This slight outline of the history of the peopling of Europe the reader may find useful to bear in mind. For the moment, it explains the similarity of the ancient religions of Europe. The great god of the Greeks, Zeus, is the Jupiter of the Romans, and Dinas Pitar of the Hindus. The old earth goddess becomes in both religions the wife of the sky god and the god of war. The god of fire, the god of water, and the goddess of love have much the same features. The deities of the Teutonic fathers of the Scandinavians, Germans, and English correspond to these, as our names of the days of the week remind us. Through the Persians and Greeks, the Romans had adopted the 7-day week of ancient Babylon and had called the days Sun's Day, Moon's Day, Mercury's Day, Mars' Day, Jove's Day, Venus's Day, and Saturn's Day, as the Latin nations still do. And our ancestors at once found the corresponding deities for Mercury, Tuisco's Day, Mars, Woden's Day, Jupiter, Thor's Day, Venus, Frigga's Day, and Saturn, Satyr's Day. Every time you write or pronounce a day of the week, you have an interesting souvenir of the primitive religion of Europe, for Christianity never could eradicate the old names. It was a nature religion, a polytheism. The lesser spirits of the tree and the forest, the well and the stream, which are important in the middle stage of the evolution of religion, had already in Europe sunk to the position of mere nymphs, fauns, sprites, elves, fairies, and hobgoblins. The religion was a cult of great gods, the spirits presiding over the chief parts of nature, together with the new gods, which new habits, hunting, war, wisdom, etc., led men to invent. Such is the substance of Greek religion when the race enters upon the stage of history. In the earlier level of Greek religion, scholars dimly trace only a cult of ancestral spirits of the usual innumerable spirits in nature. And amongst these, the gods of sky, sun, water, thunder, etc., are rising to a special position. It was the early literature of the Greeks, the poetry of Homer, which made the Olympian family of gods and goddesses so important, or show that they were then, about 1000 BC, becoming gods of a commanding description, with very definite human features. Before that, we have an obscure field of ancestral spirits, animal spirits, animism, fetishism, vegetation spirits, water spirits, etc., with the sky god Zeus above all. The other nature gods rising and the borrowing of a virgin goddess, Artemides or Athene, from the colonies of Crete, we saw that the Cretans had only a goddess, which were already in southern Greece. The evolution of Greek religion in historic times follows familiar lines with variations that once more remind us how the surroundings of a nation influenced the development of its religion. It may be necessary to remind some readers that there was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, such a country as Greece. There was, at least before Alexander the Great, no Greek kingdom or empire. The Greeks were separated by a large number of city-states, each a town with a relatively small amount of territory. Hence, one tribe could retain or adopt deities not accepted by the others, while the growth of intercourse and political amalgamation for defense led to mutual borrowings and changes of the character of gods and goddesses. In the end, the Greeks had the old nature gods, Father Zeus, his wife Hera, his daughter Athene, and all the rest, with all sorts of new attributes. Athene, the old Mother Earth, becomes goddess of war and wisdom. Apollo, the old sun god, becomes patron of arts, and so on. So far, the religion was far less definitely ethical than that of Egypt, and the gods and goddesses were frankly very immoral, though we must remember how in the great tragedies the characters call upon Zeus to punish criminals. As the Athenian civilization developed, the religion showed marked ethical developments. It was, however, mainly the laymen who stood outside the popular religions that moral idealism was most cultivated. Atheism was punished in Greece. The democracy always remained profoundly ignorant, and we cannot say today how many of its great thinkers were atheists. Many were, and some of these, like Zeno and Epicurus, developed fine codes of character. On the other hand, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were theists and held a strict ethical monotheism. There was, however, a more interesting, if less known, development in the Greek mysteries. Nearly 1,000 years before Christ, the Greeks began to adopt from the earlier European tribes the god Dionysus. Dionysus. Boy, I'm just going to struggle with that. I have the whole time I've been trying to read it. Although he is best known as the wine god Bacchus. That one I know. But was a general fertility god, and his birth and death were annually celebrated. The worshippers, sharing between themselves the piece of the body of a bull or a goat or boy in which the god was supposed to be incarnated, or communicating in his body and blood. Certain more or less secret societies especially developed this ritual and taught a most intensely spiritual and aesthetic doctrine of the immortal soul, with a corresponding disdain of the flesh. The soul was by reunification and purification to keep itself pure and merit communion with the God in the next world. These were the Orphic brotherhoods, and they had a great influence. Besides these, there was the Etruscan mysteries. Well, that was a much more widespread and of a familiar nature. The infinites drank sacred wine which infused into them the life and spirit of Mother Earth, the old Earth goddess, in whose honor, no doubt, these secret meetings were originally devised for promoting fertility. But in the historic period, they were intensely spiritual and ethical, aiming to give the worshippers a close communion with the gods and a firmer assurance of immortality. Religious pageants or dramas of the most imposing character were enacted upon the initiates, and they are described as thrilled and awed in a wonderful manner. I show in another book. Wait a minute. Hydrate, Maddie. I show in another book the myths which inspired these sacred pageants. I need only say here that in some, They represented the annual deaths or retirement underground and resurrection or reappearance of the spirit of fertility. Now we say, and see more in detail in another book, that Egypt, Babylon, and Syria had religious celebrations of a similar nature, and these found their way to Greece and spread widely. In short, both ethically, spiritually, and ritually, Greece was, by the end of the Old Era, fully prepared for Christianity. It remains only to describe the analogous development in Rome, and I may do so briefly. We can trace that the barbaric Romans took with them to Italy the usual belief in legions of spirits in nature, the usual cult of the spirits in sticks and stones and animals, as well as ancestors, and the family of nature gods and goddesses, which I have already described. But there was already a fairly civilized people. The Etruscans in central Italy and the Romans enriched their mythology by borrowing from these. Even when they settled in Rome, the Romans had ample traces of their primitive religion. Spirits of ancestors, spirits guarding the stores, goddesses of fire, with virgin devotees, god of the threshold. In fact, innumerable spirits growing into gods. Any new ideas or new fact in their lives had to have a presiding spirit, so gods and goddesses multiplied by the hundred. How far ordinary Romans believed in their existence we cannot say. Probably the question never occurred to them. But long before the time of Christ, under Greek influence, skepticism entered Rome, and religion began to move toward its final phase. We find the great orator Cicero pleading desperately for the existence of God and the soul. In fact, for the last 4 centuries of the Roman Empire, the educated man were generally followers of Zeno or Epicurus, or what we should now call agnostics. Side by side with this decay of religion amongst the educated and gay indifference to religion amongst the mass, who welcomed any kind of ceremony or demonstration, there was turning the page. There was a great growth of Oriental religions. To represent this as a craving of man's religious instinct for new forms when he found the old unsatisfactory is nonsense. Oriental priests found Rome as lucrative as Hindu word spinners and British psychologists find the cities of the United States today. Some of these new cults, like that of ISIS, appealed to wealthy ladies as Theosophy and Christian Science now do. Others, like Mithraism, appealed with their ethical message to a large, thoughtful, and often morbid-minded minority, while others, with gorgeous and striking ritual in the open air, with no mysteries but very plain allusions to the facts of life, appealed to the Romans generally. Chief amongst these was the Oriental religion, which celebrated the death and resurrection of its young god in the spring of each year. All Rome, at least, turned out to see the dramatic ceremonies, just as all Rome went into a frenzy of rejoicing over the birth of the sun, or of Saturn, or of Mithra, from December 20th to 25th. This is the authentic story of the evolution of religion up to the time of the appearance of Christianity. That's the end of chapter 7. And before we get on to chapter 8, the final chapter, we hydrate. Because I can feel the cotton mouth creeping in. Check the microphone. Yep, still on. Pardon me. All right, here we go. Chapter 8, final chapter. The rise of Christianity. There are few Christians who can read a modern work on comparative religion without feeling a certain degree of discomfort, and it increases as they approach the account given of the rise of their own religion. It does not matter what the creed of the author is, if he is a recognized master of the subject. He may be a Protestant like Reveille or a rationalist like Jastrow. It makes no difference. If the writer is fully informed and candid, hundreds of things are shown in the earlier or pagan religions, which the Christian had been taught to regard as peculiar to his own creed, and part of its exclusive revelation. He reads about ancient Egypt, which he had never thought of connecting with Christianity. He learns that at least 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians believed as strongly and definitely as he does in the moral judgment by God of each individual's soul after death and a reward of eternal bliss for the good. He finds a moral code as austere as that of his own creed. He learns of the appearance many centuries before the time of the first Hebrew prophet of a monotheism so pure and spiritual that, as we see in Religion and Morals in Ancient Egypt, Little Blue Book number 1077, some of the finest psalms in the Old Testament have been borrowed from its ritual. He sees the development of the cult of a virgin mother goddess and divine son, and reads that the birth of the son in a stable was annually celebrated in Egypt centuries before Christ, just as the resurrection of a god had been annually celebrated millennia before Christ. In fine, he reads that in and about Alexandria, where Christianity was mainly developed, Egyptian religion ended before Christ was born, in a great fervor of asceticism and celibacy, for a goddess of female chastity, and for something like conventional life. He did not know these things, but they are undisputed facts. Turning to the Babylonian religion, he may read without a shudder that the ancient priest instituted the Sabbath and taught people the creation of the world and of man, the Garden of Eden, the fall, and the deluge. Any properly educated person may be presumed to know this, but few know how we have vindicated the moral code and character of these ancient Babylonians, how we have learned that Ishtar, the wicked of the Old Testament, the wicked Aster, the wicked Aster of the Old Testament, becomes the goddess of purity, and the Babylonians groaned day and night over their sins, and men and women were put to death for adultery. Scholars have known these things for 20 years. Finally, the true story of religion, tells how Babylon evolved a monotheism of a spiritual character, had a popular god whose death and resurrection were celebrated annually, and even created a savior god. The poor Christian reader turns with anxiety to the Persian religion, and we have seen what he will find. Here again, he reads of a great and austere reformer appearing many centuries before Christ, and teaching Persia a stern code of purity and temperance. He finds, to his astonishment, that these Persians, ages before Christ, believed that God would one day destroy the world by fire, that his kingdom would come, judge the living and the dead, and assign them, respectively, an eternity of bliss or of suffering. He sees Persian religion ending in the worship of a God who takes upon himself the sins of men, whose birth in a cave is celebrated annually in midwinter, and whose liturgy is such that the Romans taunted the Christian church with having borrowed it, and who exacted the most ascetic life from his followers. And this religion is seen spreading over the Roman world far more rapidly than the contemporary Christian church until the latter introduced the Europeans to suppress it, induced the Europeans to suppress it by force. In Greece, this Christian reader, whom I imagine dipping into a manual of comparative religion, finds mystic sects which offer most impressive secret celebrations to their initiates, a popular cult in which a virgin goddess is quite a common feature, and religious thinkers who reach the purest spiritual monotheism, the most serene belief in personal immortality, and the most orthodox disdain of the flesh. In Rome, he finds that the belief in a Father in heaven is the most prominent element in the popular religion. He learns that the birthday of the unconquered sun is officially fixed in the calendar on December 25th. He hears of moralists who regarded slavery and war as crimes. He reads of nearly the whole of Rome joining in the celebration of the young god Attis every spring, and in a rejoicing over the resurrection 3 days later. In the account of the Hebrew religion, which he thought he knew, he finds that in the century before Christ, learned teachers arose amongst the Jews and taught their disciples in parables, and that many of these parables reappear in the New Testament as those of Christ. He finds that there is hardly a sentiment of the New Testament which was not current amongst those scribes and Pharisees, whom the New Testament scourges with contempt. It begins to appear that Christianity did not come upon the world like a bolt from the blue. It must have surprised no learned man in the first century, and when the history of the time is borne in mind, the evolutionary story of religion is completed. Pause for hydration. In Did Jesus Ever Live? Little Blue Book number 1084, we try to determine what we must think about Christ from the purely historical point of view. Let us merely assume here that Christianity appeared first in Judea. But Judea was smashed, and the Jews scattered in the year 70 A.D., and hardly anyone supposes that the Gospels, as we have them, were written by that time, or written in Judea. It was in the cities of the Greco-Roman world that doctrinal Christianity developed. Greece had spread over the ruins of the older world empires, and Rome, by that time, had taken over the supremacy from Greece. All round the eastern and northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea were cosmopolitan cities, where what was left of the life and culture of the older civilizations was preserved. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Athens, Thessalonica, Rome. Paul's epistles give you the names. On an earlier page, I told how thousands of years earlier, men had gone out from the Mediterranean to Egypt and Babylon and Persia, when great civilizations were developed in those places. They naturally flowed back toward the Mediterranean. They gave rise to a ring of cities from Egypt to Italy, and just as Turks, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Italians, etc. mingle today in the successors of those cities, so the races mingled in the first century before Christ, and even more extensively then, for the world was smaller and the means of traveling slower. In those melting pots of the old world, every religion had its priest and its temples. I have seen the crescent and the cross flashing side by side in the sun of the Thalencica, but that word's just confusing my brain. And I can imagine what the condition was 2,000 years ago. But any person who wills may read about it. In any great city there were places of worship of the Syrian, the Egyptian, and the Persian, the Greek, the Hebrew, and the Roman religions. There were castrated priests and celibate priests, mystic priests and more ritual priests, ascetic priests, and profligate priests, and the prophets and moralists who scorned all priests. But the crowd especially loved the picturesque religions of the East, with their annual celebrations of the birth and death and resurrection of a god, generally a handsome young god who appealed particularly to the women, just as even in ancient Judea the women deified their priest and joined in the mourning over Tammuz, the slain god of the Babylonians. So in a few centuries before Christ, the women everywhere, from Egypt to Greece and Rome, shed tears every year over the Syrian god Attis, who succeeded Tammuz and Adonis. And then this is a strange word I've never come across. Biosteriously. Yeah, biosteriously. Dude, Let me know what that one is. I'm going to have to look that one up. All right. Biosteriously celebrated his resurrection, or melted with tenderness at the annual celebration of the birth of a god as a tiny babe. Do not be impatient, Christian reader. These are well-known historical facts. I have given them, and the authorities for them, in several works, and I have never known the most audacious or the least informed of my clerical critics to question them. In other volumes of this series, these things are told in detail. I do not myself like to give this bald summary of them here, but you will understand that a mere outline of the evolution of religion enables me to do no more. All these things are proved in other booklets. Every feature of the Christian religion which any serious person thinks to be unique is examined and its sources indicated. All I have to do here is to show in a general way that Christianity and every other religion is embraced in the evolutionary scheme. Religion was like a tide slowly ascending the slope of a beach. Here and there it was held up for ages by the sand mounds or rocks, and the savage races whom I thus imagined as the obstacle to the advance of the tide still exhibit to us the more rudimentary forms through which all religious ideas passed. Here and there were channels on the beach, and the tide flowed on with comparative rapidity and formed large temporary lakes. But it was all one natural tide, the advance of the human mind. Pause for hydration. The advancing progress of religions, the superiority of the latest to the earlier, is just as natural as the advancing progress through the ages of machinery, commerce, or law. But there is one mighty difference. The progress of the latter increases in exact proportion as man's mind grows in wisdom and intelligence. The pace of religion slackens in precisely the same proportion. The tide has already turned. The ebb is visible all over the world. They would be so disappointed at where we are today. Finally, let me recall a remark which I made at the beginning of this book. The history of religion is not so much a history of ideas as of priesthoods. The ideas are incorporated in wealthy and powerful organizations of priests, and it is, naturally, these who fight for them, and it is they who resent the idea of progress. Revelation is the most fatally obstructive idea that ever entered the mind of man, and it was quite obviously put there by priests. It is priesthoods today who sustain the tottering fabric. There is no religious instinct in the race. There is no superhuman wisdom in the rise of religions or superhuman power in their spread and maintenance. And someday the historian will write the complete history of religion, from its dawn in the blurred mind of a savage to its death in the minds of the last, it's printed over, minds of the last something, and he will almost weep at the colossal misdirection of man's resources and devotion. Boy, that'll be a beautiful day, won't it? I doubt I'll get to see it. Okay, anyway, that is the end of Little Blue Book number 1030, The World's Great Religions, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1940s, 1926, 27, something around there. Anyhow, thanks for listening, and join me in another Little Blue Book.